Imagine living in a country that suddenly becomes rich, not because its people invented something groundbreaking or built a new industry, but simply because it discovered something valuable beneath its soil. And for most of us, that would sound like an incredible stroke of luck, right? Almost like finding treasure. But what looks like a gift at first can slowly turn into a problem that no one saw coming. And to understand this better, let's travel back to the 1960s and revisit a moment in history where something very similar happened. And I want you to keep in mind how familiar parts of the story might feel later on. We are going to the Netherlands, where Dutch disease caused unemployment to rise by over 300%, from 1.1% to about 5.1% at its peak. And back then, our Dutch friends and strong European allies discovered massive natural gas reserves close to their actually beautiful city Groningen. And here we're talking about roughly 2,700 billion cubic meters of gas. And to give you a sense of scale, today, decades later, the remaining 20% of gas around these fields alone could supply the country in terms of total gas consumption for 15 more years. So nevertheless, the Dutch government stopped exploiting these gas fields since there were earthquakes around and recorded in the area. It probably won't be extracted in the near future anyway. But when the news broke in the 60s, the mood couldn't have been better across the Netherlands and among its people. During the Second World War, the civilian population had to endure German occupation, and now it felt as if the country had just unlocked a new era of prosperity. And in many ways, that feeling made sense. The timing was perfect. Next door, West Germany, there was an emerging industrial powerhouse of Europe. And West Germany at the time was rebuilding its economy after the war, and it needed enormous amounts of energy because the German economy has always been very export focused. So the Netherlands suddenly became a key supplier, and money started pouring into the Dutch economy at a breathtaking pace, actually. But economists soon began to notice puzzling changes. Imports became surprisingly cheap for the Netherlands, and a lot of industries started struggling heavily. So the Dutch government at the time began to wonder, why is this happening? And years later, two economists, Max Corden and James Peter Neary, would give this phenomenon a name that you've possibly heard of: Dutch disease. So what exactly happened? Well, think about it this way. If one sector of an economy suddenly becomes extremely profitable, it starts pulling in attention. And with that comes workers and investment. And because the gas sector became so profitable so quickly, it quickly offered higher wages. So people left manufacturing, they left agriculture and other parts of the economy to join and benefit from this sector. And capital followed the same path. And as the Dutch sold more and more gas abroad, the currency they had access to was a lot of foreign currency, because that's what their customers paid in. And in turn, this also made imported goods cheaper for the Dutch, which sounds great as a consumer in the Netherlands, but it quietly suffocated domestic industries that couldn't no longer compete, which contributed to rapid unemployment in those sectors. Now, keep that feeling in mind. First, there was the excitement, we found the gas fields, then there was the boom, we're selling lots of it, and in the end, there are lots of unintended consequences. So if we fast forward to today, we can see a remarkably similar pattern in a country that almost everyone has heard about in the context of military spending and energy exports, which is Russia. Because Russia's economy has long depended on oil and gas. But in recent years, we've seen a particularly dramatic and troubling version of Dutch disease unfold. One that is fueled not just by resources, but by actual war. And especially in Russia's more remote regions, there's heavy recruiting by the Russian government for the war effort. Partly because the Russian leadership thinks of them as expendable, but mostly to spare the citizens living in the more European, bigger Western cities, like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Because the people living in these remote regions are usually not ethnically Russian. And in these remote regions, like the Far East, families are currently experiencing sudden, extraordinary inflows of cash. And that's not happening from new industries or from economic productivity, but actually from government war payments, from enlistment bonuses or death compensations to the soldiers' families. So these families often receive tens of thousands of dollars for their loved one killed in the war. And to put it into perspective, in some regions, these payouts actually equal 10, 20, even 30 years of normal average income. Imagine earning in a single day what normally would take you decades. How would your life change? And that's exactly what happens. People who previously struggled to make ends meet suddenly find themselves buying things they would have never imagined at any time owning. So they are going to buy fur coats, they are buying electronics, they want to renovate their kitchens and want to consume imported goods, for example. So what we're seeing right now is their local economies lighting up with demand, which is of course fueled by injected money from the government. And if we didn't look beneath the surface, it might seem as if the regions are booming, right? But just like in the Netherlands, this sudden wealth hides a dangerous imbalance. The Russian economy is in no position right now to meet this demand. Why? Well, because so many working age men have either been mobilized or absorbed into the military industrial sector. So these people aren't able to consume or contribute to the economy and the labor market. So understandably, we see labor shortages stretch across Russia right now and across various industries, such as retail, construction, agriculture, and other relevant sectors to the Russian economy. And everywhere you look, there aren't enough workers to keep things running. While the supply can't keep up, the demand for new products and services constantly rises, though, among the Russian consumer, which in turn forces businesses to raise their prices because they can't expand the supply. And suddenly the massive bonuses that these families get that once felt life-changing lose their buying power actually shockingly fast. And at this point, many people ask the obvious question: why isn't the government trying to fix it? The Kremlin wants to sustain support for its war while preventing unrest at home. And to do that, it pays people these huge amounts of money, enough to momentarily mask the real situation. Because behind the scenes, the state is actually struggling to keep this illusion alive. Payments are increasingly delayed or reduced, and we've seen several reports of it. I will include some here. And Russia also has recently been forced to sell more than half of its gold reserves, over 230 tons, just to finance these payouts. And Russia had previously been the 5th largest holder of gold reserves in the world. Now, at this point, it may feel like Dutch disease is an economic trap you can't escape, right? But that's not true, actually. We know this because the Netherlands eventually did find a way out. What made the difference wasn't luck. It was actually honesty and action. Because the Dutch government recognized that their economy had essentially become imbalanced. So they accepted responsibility for the consequences of their own policies and actions. And instead of doubling down on gas exports, they reinvested the wealth to build something more stable, a more diversified economy. Sadly, it got really cold when I was filming and my camera stopped working because of the freezing temperatures. But I'll just continue from my comfy and cozy desk. So I was in the middle of talking about how the Dutch ultimately overcame the disease they had created. And in the 60s, following the great gas boom from the gas fields in Groningen, the government decided to boost social and welfare spending. And when it got to the 70s, the Dutch really found themselves caught between a rock and a hard place because the oil prices were sharply dropping. We had the first global energy and oil crisis in 1973, and back then, it would, of course, and would still be today, widely unsupported to cut back on these benefits all of a sudden. So to ultimately overcome the situation, they used the opportunity to expand in other sectors. They started to produce petrochemicals, they forced energy-intensive industries such as manufacturing and started exports in these sectors again. And government funds boosted greenhouse agriculture, for example, and of course the service, trade and logistics industries. And over time, the economy actually rebalanced. So non-gas exports and the other previously weakened industries, they regained competitiveness, which were helped by these structural reforms. Meaning, in the end, it's actually possible if a government really wants it to be possible. In Russia, though, wealth and decision making are concentrated at the top, so short term profit for a few is prioritized over the health of the broader economy. And this makes the effects of Dutch disease harder to control. In the article I'm about to introduce, we see a development that could become a serious long term problem for Russia. But before we dive deeper, let me quickly explain why this source, the National Security Journal, is actually quite reliable. Everything gets checked for accuracy here and plagiarism, and they classify most of their work as opinion and analysis, so they're really upfront about what kind of content you're reading. They're funded only through ads, and they don't take money from governments or directly from defense contractors. So it's really fascinating. Also, what this author here has to say, Ruben Johnson, he has 36 years of experience within the military industry. He's worked for the US Department for Defense, for the US Navy and Air Force, for example, but also for governments like the UK and Australia. And he's actually a survivor of the full-scale Russian invasion of 2022 as well. Anyway, let's talk about this fascinating article here. Since 2022, of course, we've seen arms plants tripling. So they increased from about 2,000 arms plants to around 6,000 now. But now we see cash running out. Back in September, it was reported that the Yaroslavl shipbuilding plant hasn't been able to pay its 850 workers, simply because the defense ministry's progress payment stalled. And this Yaroslavl shipbuilding plant builds surface vessels and rescue tugs, so it's really an important plant. But what is happening right now, and we've talked about it in the video as well, is regional governments funding huge enlistment bonuses, and they're actually forced to do that by the Russian government. And that's gone so far that the first region has now stopped all war bonuses and injury or death compensation simply because their funds were depleted. And that is the region of Yakutia. Keep that in mind because it's going to be interesting later on. And this article goes on and on about the Russian economy, and it's a really fascinating read if you're interested. Anyway, Yakutia actually plays a specific and kind of interesting role because its finance minister, Ivan Alexeyev, in a rare form of honesty for a Russian government, actually said, yes, unfortunately, this is indeed our situation. Our funds are depleted. And that's really not a surprise because they had previously been paying up to $29,000 for a contract signed. And of course, these regional governments are also responsible for such things as keeping the healthcare system afloat and infrastructure and general, just government spending that you would have to make civilian life possible. So this really hurts the Russian economy and the Russian people itself as well. And we see, other regions also reducing enlistment payouts, such as Tatarstan or Belgorod, while other regions have been forced to eliminate these bonuses completely. So it's really questionable how long the Russian economy can sustain this war effort, and it's going to be interesting to see moving on. And in the next video, we'll look at Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. And because of latest recent developments, I will also have to include Ukrainian strikes on oil tankers, because we've seen that happen on the regular by now. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you on the next one, here on 10 Minutes of Geopolitics.